Do you enjoy the harvest of Missouri through food, fuel, or fiber? Interested in strengthening your community or making a difference in the lives of others? You're in the right place. This is Stand for Ag with Missouri Farmers Care. Join us for thoughtful conversations around the intersections of farmer, rancher, and consumer interests. Grab a seat, press play, and join the conversation.
Welcome back to this episode of Stand for Ag with Missouri Farmers Care. We're excited you're tuning in today and have a great conversation that we're launching into with Steve Murphy. Steve's the general manager of Poet Biorefining Laddonia, one of Missouri's 6 ethanol plants. And welcome to Stand for Ag, Steve.
Thanks for having me.
So the ethanol industry has been alive and well in Missouri since 2001, I believe. Steve, is that right?
I think 2000.
2000. And
the Macon plant had their 20th anniversary last year.
There you go. And the Macon plant was our inaugural first. It cut ground in Missouri for a farmer-owned ethanol model that was very successful in its time and has evolved in its level of production and in its management into the 6 ethanol plants that we have today, including Poet Biorefining Macon and Poet Biorefining Laddonia, right, Steve?
You are correct.
So tell us a little bit about the scope and scale of Laddonia and Macon, if you feel comfortable, both of those being Poet plants. Tell us a little bit about the corn demand, economy. What are the highlights in your communities?
Well, we'll start with Macon a little bit just because it was the first, and it started in 2000, as I mentioned. It was originally a 13 million gallon plant, and it was successful enough that it's now producing over 50 million gallons of biofuels a year.
So that was 13 million to 50 million.
From 1.3 to 5.0, yeah. So it's grown quite a bit. There were at least 2 major expansions during that time. One to get it up to from 13 to 40, and another to get it from 40 up over 50. That was so successful that in 2006, the Laddonia plant was added in Missouri as well, with Poet as the managing partner and Poet Technology, but with local farmers being the primary investors and customers for the biofuels. So we came along, and we were originally a 50 million gallon plant, and we just completed an expansion in May of 21 and are now an 80 million gallon facility. So
wow,
plants have increased production and increased demand for corn. So but Laddonia will need about 28 million bushels going forward annually. And that's about the 10 million gallons added over 3 million bushels of additional demand to stay local.
I know, having worked for the Missouri Corn Growers Association and closely with those founders of Missouri's ethanol industry, I was amazed, and I'm sure that you can bring me up to speed, Steve, the technology differences between the original Macon plant and the first build at Laddonia were an entire generation or 2 of technology, right? That we were able to step up. We talk a lot on here about continual improvement and how we're always doing more with less in agriculture. And that is no different with biofuels. So I haven't been to the Laddonia plant recently, but I'm guessing there's some cutting edge technology that's being employed there in Audrain County.
Yeah, particularly on the energy management side and side of where a lot of the growth is. But from when Macon came on, the existing technology was standard fermentation, where you cooked the mash prior to generate enzymes for the process start breaking the starches into sugars so that the yeast could feed on those sugars and produce. By the time Laddonia came along, Poet had come along with a cold cook process that eliminated that step, and now we add the enzymes ourselves to generate that, so we don't have to bring up the mash to generate those and then quench it back down for the yeast. So again, less energy intensive. It's now recycle all the waters in the plant, that neither one discharges to the environment, so we're less water intensive. And when the plant started, the distiller's grains were a byproduct. They were just something that we didn't know what to do with. There wasn't really a market for it, and that's developed over time as a competitor to bean meal rations as a high protein alternative to supplement hay and other other things that might make up the ration for whatever species of animal you have. So, and that's where a lot of the growth has happened, is on the co-products, dealing with that third of the kernel that is not consumed in the process, because we only convert the starch. The other 1/3, the fat, the fiber, the minerals and nutrients, are still left over and still go back into the process, back into the economy as animal feed, as corn oil, as liquefied CO2 and other products. And that's where a lot of the refinement is capturing the value of those other portions of the kernel, because nothing goes to waste. And that's where a lot of the advancements has been on that side.
Mm-hmm. So it is really a beautiful process in that there's a lot of technology, as I said, employed in these plants, but the process itself is pretty simple, right? It's pretty simple to visualize on a flow chart that they're bringing in whole kernel corn. They're using enzymes to break it into, as Steve said, those components of the carbohydrates that are able to be turned into that alcohol and eventually refined into that ethanol, the vitamins, minerals, proteins, and oils that can go out in several, probably you can tell me about the enhanced product streams, but a lot of that animal agriculture has built around a ability to use distillers grains in our rations, and has turned into a net gain for many. Our cattle are often limited in protein, not in carbohydrates in their diet. And so that's a high value product for animal agriculture. And then, as you said, something that people often don't know about is CO2. So tell us a little bit about those other product streams that come out of the plant.
Sure. The yeast produced carbon dioxide as they ferment. Mm-hmm. Because it's off of a biological process, it's a very clean CO2, as opposed to something that's combustion that might have soots and other VOCs from incomplete combustion, carbon monoxide, and other contaminants. But because we're coming off of yeast producing carbon dioxide, it's a very clean CO2. So we make some of the highest purity for both food and beverage grade users. So if you're using Coke or Pepsi or even packaging for some frozen foods, things, our liquefied CO2 is used in a lot of those applications because it has such a high purity grade. So one of the things that we're kind of always coming up with new ideas on. The Macon plant added dry ice production as well last year, about a year ago, maybe two. So again, another use for that, because the problem is the dry ice market and the beverage market somewhat cyclical. There's bigger demand in the summer, less in the winter months. People drink more sodas in the summer, less in the winter. You need more refrigeration, more packing materials to ship things in the summer, in the winter. So there's a little bit of seasonality to that market, just like there is with our animal rations. We make a lot of more wet cake for local cattle guys in the winter months when pastures are not available to than we do in the summer months. So we try to take advantage of those markets when they're available, when people want us to be in those markets. And that gives people in livestock other options for feed sources than they would have normally.
So we haven't, sorry, Steve. We
The
haven't.
other one that's really blown up though is corn oil because of biodiesel. And so that was something that came along in about 2011 is when the corn oil market started to become a real player. So for about 10 years.
And renewable diesel is a buzzword that I hear a lot, but also a real opportunity for corn, soy, and other oils. So tell us just a little bit about that market.
Yeah, we only produce the oil. We don't convert to biodiesel. We let others do that because it takes a lot of feedstocks to run a biodiesel plant, and the amount of corn we grind doesn't generate enough to support a separate unit to do that on site. But now Poet is getting into more refined oil, higher clarity oil, higher purities. That's perfectly suited and tailored for that growing market. So that's the thing that is a big investment being made as we speak at a new expansion of plant in Iowa.
So we haven't talked a lot on here about supply chain issues, but everybody in this country is well aware of current supply chain issues. Just as an interesting side note, I just was able to tour a major, a good size beef processing operation. And one of the challenges they had there, in addition to labor, which is also pervasive throughout
Mm.
the marketplace, was dry ice. There's a lot of dry ice. Those products need to leave at a food safe temperature, right? And so they're often cutting those whole muscle cuts, dropping them into dry ice to ensure food quality from the very moment they start that process. And one of the hurdles that they had been seeing was dry ice. So I'm sure that the service provided by that dry ice market has been a lifesaver in ensuring that we continue to fill those grocery store shelves. The things that people got a little view of during COVID, that those supply chains are able to still be fed, because as we know, it's not a lack of corn in the marketplace, right? Or a lack of cattle in farms. It's those supply chain disruptions that are challenging, but they'd worked through some of that and found adequate dry ice supplies. But that's interesting to know that right in Macon, Missouri, we're producing some of that supply that's needed across the nation.
Yep, and as one of the a lot of the plants that produce it also produce fertilizers. Some of the plants produce it, and they use natural gas. And natural gas prices have gone up so dramatically. They're less competitive now on some of those things. So I could see plants producing more of the needed both CO2, liquefied and dry ice versions forward.
So we've talked a little bit about CO2, so that let's delve into greenhouse gases just a little bit. That takes me to the climate conversation that's going on throughout the country and the world right now. Tell me about the environmental or the carbon footprint of the ethanol industry. Should consumers feel good when they're fueling up at the pump with ethanol?
Absolutely. As farming has got greener with cover crops, precision farming, no-till, less chemicals being applied, or only as needed just to manage cost. You've got drones that are managing fields. Now, there's so much that has happened in agriculture that farmers know about that a lot of other people don't. And how just a lot of it's efficiencies, but a lot of those efficiencies generate less CO2 in the process. So as farming has gotten greener, that's a big component because that's our feedstock. And then on our end, we're getting more gallons out of every bushel of corn than we ever have. And we're using less energy to produce that than we ever have. So both the agriculture feedstock side and the ethanol industry itself have gotten greener. And one thing that a lot of people don't know is that ethanol right now, on average, is 46% cleaner on CO2 than a gallon of gasoline per a recent Harvard study. Number keeps getting better. The Laddonia and Macon plants in particular both generate electricity for the grid using combined heat and power, where we have a utility partner who manages a turbine that generates electricity, and it's essentially a jet engine, and the engine has an exhaust, and that exhaust powers a boiler that generates steam. Steam is what we use in distillation to separate the ethanol. Because at the end of the day, these biorefineries are big stills. We're making moonshine, and we need heat to separate the water from the ethanol. And by using combined heat and power, those BTUs get used twice, once to generate electricity and another time to generate steam. And we actually produce more electricity for the grid than the plants use by a factor of 2 to 1 or better. And we're actually looking to potentially grow that even more, because the market for carbon is saying that's being greener is where it's at. And to be competitive to grow our share of the fuel tank, go from 10, 15% or higher blends, or to compete with electric vehicles and other things. We know that's the direction we're going, and POET and other ethanol producers, the industry at large, is moving towards that.
I know as a consumer, I feel good. So you've spelled out on the production side the benefits, and we haven't even talked about global transportation of oil or anything like that. But I know that as early as the 1990s, ethanol's clean air benefits have been recognized. They've been recognized ethanol's clean air benefits have been recognized in cities that had air quality issues. And I know that benefit only continues to grow, let alone switching gears, I also really appreciate being able to fuel up with ethanol because of employment and economic activity that's generated right here in the Midwest from our corn. So paint a picture just in Laddonia. So in small town America, in Audrain County, what does the employment or economic impact reverberate out of the Poet Laddonia plant?
Well, we're going to buy 28 million bushels of corn. So just on a corn use, corn's now almost $6 a bushel, between 5 and 6. It was higher earlier. So just to keep the math simple, we'll multiply by $5 a bushel and 28 million. That's $140 million of ag products and being converted here at the Laddonia alone. And we're just a small fraction of the ethanol industry at large. Poet's the largest ethanol producer in the world, but we have 33 sites, and each of those sites touches that surrounding area because all our corn comes from a 1-hour drive around the plant, the bulk within 30 miles. And since we've expanded this year, we have re-added 78 new producers to supply the plant just since September 1st. We need to control more of the local market and compete with exports that go to the river. So primary market in our area would be the ethanol plant or being exported overseas. And so now we're keeping those bushels local. We're converting them using Missouri labor for Missouri markets, for Missouri cattle, and growing that market. So it's a much better use and touches more jobs with drivers and else than it would be if we just put it on a barge and send it down to the Gulf.
Absolutely. I think sometimes maybe we haven't done a good enough job. Consumers love local food, right? They're always looking for those local products with that touch of home. And maybe we haven't done a good enough job getting it's hard to message to consumers filling up the fuel pump. We all know that, but consumers should feel proud that it is a local fuel that feeds right back to the farm, as you've just spelled out, that there's a touch of Missouri in their fuel tank. And that's something to feel pretty good about when fueling up with E10, E15, all the way up to higher blends up to E85.
I think that's a great point because Missouri doesn't have an oil industry. We don't have any real big refineries. We distribute. The closest refinery is in Wood River, Illinois. So if you want to keep money within the state, the ethanol industry both supports agriculture, which is the #1 industry both in Missouri and in the United States, far surpassing or anything else that a lot of people don't. They get all the publicity. Agriculture is far bigger than any other industry, and keeping that at home, improving emissions, particularly with all the focus on carbon dioxide, people forget about the traditional pollutants, carbon monoxide, the soots, the nitrous oxides, the thing that makes smog. Because ethanol so clean burning, because it has an extra oxygen atom, really helps the combustion to work on those traditional pollutants. So it's not just a rural issue it's got a lot of benefits for people in the city that use the bulk of the fuel and improving air quality locally. And the other thing we are a net exporter of ethanol to the globe. We produce more than we use. And even though we do export oil, we still import more oil than we export. And so that dynamic has not changed. And that's reflected in prices at the pump today. We're back to $3 a gallon locally. And higher blends are a good alternative to that when you're shopping for alternatives.
Absolutely. I think often, and maybe it's because of my work with ethanol and promoting this Midwest made fuel. I was just having a conversation about, again, the global supply chain and retail choices that we make. And somebody quoted a US senator and said, do you hear that great big sucking sound? That's our capital. That's our country's net worth heading overseas as we buy low priced retail goods or as we buy foreign oil, largely sourced offshore. And so that's just a point that I keep in mind when I may need to go to one extra step to ensure that I'm finding a retailer that is offering some Missouri made fuels. It's a feel good for me. And I know that consumers can look for that too.
I
So
agree. I go out of my way. I'm in the industry, obviously,
Mhm.
to find E15 and E30 blends when I can.
yes. So speaking about supply chains, COVID created lots of challenges. I know the ethanol industry offered to step up. So how were, you're producers of alcohol essentially that is then refined. Um, were they able to create some hand sanitizers and other products? I saw early communications on this, but were ethanol plants able to help fill that void that was and that large demand that was created by COVID in the marketplace?
Exactly. That's one thing about having so many small sites is they can be very nimble, adjust production. A few poet sites, and along with a lot of the industry, has switched to not just making fuel grade ethanol, but are now making USP, which is US pharmaceutical grade, and even in what is called grain neutral spirits or beverage grade product for other applications, can be used in cough syrups and other things as well. So there's a lot of things that use ethanol or alcohol in their formulations, and the ethanol industry saw a need and stepped into that to fill that void during COVID. But those investments are still there and still producing gallons for those additional markets as we go on.
That is absolutely fascinating to me. I know that there was a scramble that put everybody into looking. And so thanks to the ethanol industry for stepping in that void. Okay, we've talked a little bit about consumers. Tell me how consumers can support. We haven't really talked about the blends available, retail available, vehicles. Tell me a little bit how consumers can support this industry.
Well, whether people know it or not, about 96% of the gallons sold are already 10% ethanol. You're already supporting to some degree, whether you know it or not.
And it doesn't have to be labeled on the pump, right?
No,
That
it does not.
blend is-
Not in Missouri. That's a state regulation, so it varies state by state. But one thing they don't realize is ethanol is 113 octane. And so it's blended with lower grade gasoline that's 84 octane to create the 87 you see at the pump. And that helps lower the price because as octane goes up, it typically costs more money to produce that grade of gasoline or a grade of when it's from petroleum. But when you add ethanol at higher blends, E15 and E30 are the mid-level blends, it's kind of a sweet spot. All cars 2001 and newer can run on E15, which is sometimes branded as unleaded 88 at retailers because it's 88 octane. And some of the stations in mid-Missouri that I go to have it about at a dime discount as of yesterday when I filled up to the price of regular unleaded. And then you get up into E30, which is about 93 octane, which is great for cars that need higher compression and are tuned for higher octane. That's another additional 10 cents cheaper, so 20 cents to 87 octane, but significantly cheaper than the 93 octane for those cars that require premium. So as we move forward, we need to get automakers and consumers and the fuel systems all aligned so that we run the best fuel that's optimized for the vehicles. But as I said, all cars 2001 and newer can run on E15 per EPA guidelines. And I've been running in our mine for a car for a number of years. And so that would be a great way to support additional Missouri fuels versus imported oil and other and dirtier fuels in general.
And for those that may not have been involved, make no mistake that this is the David and Goliath situation in that the ethanol industry is David and the oil industry is Goliath. And there are a lot of decisions made on particularly federal policy. Missouri has been very supportive, in my opinion, of its ethanol industry in general. But there's a lot of federal policy because there are a lot of lobbyists that walk the halls of Washington, D.C. And so you're right, there's a lot of work left to do. What is POET looking for or advocating for on a federal level to help continue support and increase the market share of the fuel tank?
Few things. First is no more small refinery exemptions to the renewable fuel standard. They are required to blend a certain number of gallons every year. So a lot of refineries have requested and been granted waivers over the years. So that's still under review. We've changed administrations. It's an EPA managed program. So we've changed from the Trump administration to the Biden administration, have a new EPA. They really haven't tipped their hand on what they're planning to do, anything. So that's very hard to get a gauge on what they're going to do. It's important that we get our voice heard on that issue. That's one. We're trying to get E15 to be allowed sold year round. There are still some restrictions that are antiquated that allow only E10 to be sold during the summer months. We're trying to get that so we can sell E15 year round. That was a court case that we had a waiver, then a court took it away. So there's the battle in the courts, and the regulatory regimen continues on and on. So there's a lot we're doing to try to get consumer choice in the market. E15 is not a mandate. It's just another option for consumers to choose when they pull up to a pump. They can pick the best fuel at the best price that works for them. And I think ethanol's got a great story, whether it's price, value, emissions, carbon intensity, homegrown fuel, its value to rural America. There's a lot of upside versus the alternatives, and I think we're getting there. But there's also a lot of buzz about electric cars now, and getting infrastructure for that, and charging stations, and all of that. And we want to be part of that, the green revolution, as far as getting higher blends rolled out, because those charging stations and electric vehicles are great, but they don't do anything for the vehicles that are on the road now. Where ethanol we can change overnight, have more impact by rolling out E15 than all the electric vehicles that are on the road right now.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Thank you. Is there anything we haven't covered? We've had a pretty wide-ranging conversation here. What else, Steve, should we know or talk about the ethanol industry?
Oh, there's a lot of dynamics going on. Where to start? But I will say we part of our expansion, when we added more capacity, we also became more energy efficient. We added some new technologies there as well to be less energy intense and improve just because it's efficient. Buying electrical gas or using electricity, that's a cost. So and as those costs continue to rise, those investments become easier to justify just on a straight up economics basis. You don't really need to worry about the greenhouse gas intensity or subsidies or anything. And the ethanol industry hasn't been subsidized for a number of years now. I think it was 2007 when, wasn't it? I forget the year now. It's been a long time. It's been over nearly a decade where ethanol subsidies have gone away. And the industry's been self-supporting since. So now we got electric car industry that's in that road, batteries and charging stations, and incentives for consumers to buy electric vehicles. And I think flex fuel vehicles getting more incentives, or getting our message out and let them know that they can recover those much lower costs very, very quickly if the fuel is a great story to have.
I think that it is a great story to tell all the way around. The one thing I haven't asked you, Steve, what's the total production of the ethanol industry across the country at this time? Do you know?
I know we blend about 15 billion gallons a year, and I would capacity in the 17 billion gallon neighborhood if every plant was running at full capacity, but that's just a guess. I do know it's over 15 billion gallons though, and Poet now is 3 billion gallons of that in total.
That's a lot of corn, a lot of ethanol, a lot of distillers, and a
that's
lot of economic impact.
Poet alone is over 1 billion bushels of corn annually.
That stays, as you said, in one of 34, 33 locations. Yep, across the Midwest primarily.
So a very diverse footprint across the Corn Belt and in mid-America.
Well, thank you for the conversation today. This is one of a 3-part series delving into Missouri ethanol and biofuels. And I would say we'll also be delving into the opportunities that we just touched on here today with renewable diesel and biodiesel and the benefits that we see to Missouri from those products as well. So thank you for tuning into this episode. Steve, thank you for joining us in this conversation and for sharing what you do every day across Missouri and there in Laddonia.
Thanks, Ashley. Appreciate the opportunity.
Yes, it's been a pleasure.
Thank you for joining the Stand for Ag podcast with Missouri Farmers Care. We're excited to bring you new stories each week. We as agriculturalists have a lot of stories to tell. Stories of resilience, grit, and stories of families that are united by their passion for agriculture. Each week, tune in for a new episode and join the conversation.